Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us at this special webinar. So we have a very simple agenda. I'm going to issue a brief welcome in a second, and then Devadas will go straight in with his presentation on COVID-19. Where do we go from here? And the Q&A will follow at the end. So yes, on behalf of the publisher, Marshall Cavendish, Devadas himself, and myself, Glenn Ray, the Associate Director of Global Marketing at Future Moves Group, the company founded and led by Devadas, I'd like to just welcome you all and thank you for making time to join us today. It promises to be a very engaging talk, and we hope you're all doing very safe and well in these continued troubling times with COVID. So enjoy the session, and I'll just introduce you to the star of the show, Devadas Krishnadas, who is a public policy expert, strategist, and author with more than 20 years of experience in the public and private sectors. He's the CEO of Future Moves Group, and he brings to the table his expertise in foresight, strategic planning, and public policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation. His book, Confronting COVID-19, a strategic playbook for leaders and decision makers, which was published about 9 months ago, is one of 6 books published by Devadas to date. So without further ado, I will hand over to Devadas and he will lead the discussion from here. Thank you, Devadas.
Thank you, Glenn, and welcome to all of you. I'd like to thank Marshall Cavendish for making this possible, and to all of you for attending the session and making time to listen to what I have to share. COVID-19 is an extremely complicated and complex issue with multiple dimensions. It's impossible to be exhaustive in covering all aspects of it, but I will be looking at the macro picture, and then at the end, I'll be zeroing on the Singapore situation. Now, I hope that in the Q&A, we'll be able to zero in on issues which interest you as participants more particularly, and where I can, I'll try to answer them to the fullest extent. But I'm a firm believer in answering questions that you are knowledgeable on. I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist, but I hope that having written a book and following this issue closely for the last 18 months, that I'll be able to speak reasonably knowledgeably to you on all the questions you have to ask. Now, when we talk about the dimensions that we're going to be covering today, I'll be talking about globalization, multilateralism, global trade, urbanization, and digitalization. But I'm going to begin by taking an overview of the COVID picture globally. So if I could have the next slide. What we can see here is that the total number of cases is on the decline. So contrary to the kind of sensational headlines that we read every day, and there is no underestimating the devastating toll that the Delta variant is taking in places like India. So I certainly don't want to understate the impact it's having in certain parts of the world, like India and Brazil. But from a global perspective, the situation is improving. However, as foretold in my book, COVID-19 Strategic Playbook, the virus is taking a wave pattern. So you can see that it increases, falls away, and then increases again. This is due to a complex matrix of factors. One, policy considerations, whether governments make the right calculation in terms of policy restrictions and opening up, whether those are timely, those are rigorous enough, whether they make right judgments. Secondly, whether populations comply with those restrictions or push back against them and create political pressure to open up before they are ready. And thirdly, because the virus is also mutating, and that's why we've gotten about 4 to 6 different variants, with the Delta variant seemingly proving the most deadly. I think fourthly is also the issue of vaccination, and the flow of vaccination and the ratio and rate of vaccination flow, not just at the national level, but at the global level. I think we have to be realistic and expect that new variants have not just evolved, but there are more that are likely to emerge going forward. COVID is a very smart virus, and it's probably going to adapt to some of the vaccines or all of the vaccines that have been introduced today. Now, I want to pause here and talk a little bit about vaccines particularly, because I think there's been a lot of cloudiness over the understanding of the different vaccines that are available. Let me just be clear that there are three types of vaccines. There are vaccines which are conventional origin, which use the whole bacterium, which is killed off by radiation or heat and introduced into the body to create an immune response. Most vaccines are created that way historically. The second approach is where a subunit of the virus, which is a live virus, but a portion of it that is particularly targeted, is introduced into the body to create an immune response in relation to that particular part of the virus that we want to have vaccinated against. So in the case of COVID, these would be the spiky parts around the virus that latch on to our cells and create an infection. The third and the most controversial is the mRNA vaccine strain. This is where we're introducing DNA messaging, which is turned into RNA activity, which trains our genes to recognize the vaccine and protect ourselves against it. Now, none of these three approaches has 100% efficacy, but it is worth noting that concerns over mRNA originate from the fact that prior to COVID, no mRNA vaccine had been approved anywhere in the world. So it's certainly true to say that it is a novel vaccine fighting a novel virus. However, the benefits of mRNA versus the conventional vaccines is that the conventional vaccine using whole bacterium takes a very long time to produce. The subunit vaccine has an efficacy lesser than that of the mRNA. And mRNA vaccine production is highly scalable. And that really matters in our combat against COVID on a global scale. So vaccine inequality is slowly being addressed through initiatives such as COVAX and Gavi, where public and private come together in order to try to not only develop vaccines, but to put together the supply chain and logistics that are necessary to distribute the vaccine more equitably across the globe. Because none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And so there has to be more willingness. And at the G7, we saw that there was more willingness on the part of advanced economies to cooperate and contribute. And it's particularly gratifying to see the United States return to being a global sharer instead of being fully nationalist, taking a fully nationalist posture as it did under the Trump administration. Under the Biden administration, they're going to be making 60 million doses or more available for global distribution. The other point about COVID-19 is it's going to be here for years. With vaccination, hopefully it will reduce in intensity and deadliness to where influenza and pneumonia is today. And it is something, therefore, that will be tolerable. But it's likely that we are going to need booster shots periodically through the years to keep ahead of variants that emerge over time. What we need to work on as vaccination rates go up is clearly to create vaccination and travel protocols such as vaccination passports. This is going to be highly contingent on international cooperation to create a global database that is verifiable and will raise confidence on a bilateral and a multilateral basis in order for us to be able to return to some form of normalcy at the global level, not just at the local level. And I expect that this will take place between 2021 and 2023 because these initiatives are already in progress in terms of discussions, in terms of coordination, and also in terms of development. So overall, I think it's important to pay attention to the headlines, but not to get drawn into a rabbit hole of pessimism that the world is coming to an end or we are losing the fight against COVID. The data shows that we're winning the fight against COVID. What matters is that individual countries learn the lessons from others which have done well, apply them, and countries which do not have the means or the supply chain mechanics in order to be able to distribute the vaccine, get the help that they need, which is not only the vaccines, but also the funding and the technical expertise for the delivery of the vaccines to their population. Having said that, my focus today is going to be global on what may change and what will not change due to COVID-19. And as I mentioned right at the start, the list is not exhaustive, but I'll be looking at 5 dimensions: globalization, multilateralism, global trade, urbanization, and digitalization. First of all, let me say that notwithstanding geopolitics and notwithstanding COVID-19, globalization will continue. The world is already globally integrated in a way that is impossible to disentangle. I think the China and G7 tensions, as was evident at the most recent G7 meeting where the United States tried to get the other G6 countries to form a coalition against China at a political level and diplomatic level, will have negative impacts, but I think mostly superficially at this point of time, primarily because all these economies have too much at stake and too much to lose by having an economic contest with China. They have companies which have invested billions in China, and they have companies from China which have invested billions in them. And so notwithstanding the encouragement and the direction, and perhaps to some extent the dictation by the US, one of the things that has emerged in the 4 years after the Trump administration is that Western European and North American economies like Canada have learned to be much more resilient and much more independent of the United States. And they also understand today that while the Biden administration has turned the needle 180 degrees and brought the United States back to the table of the international fora, that the United States can swing 180 degrees and go back in the other direction. So they are much more interested in the longer term and what matters to them at the national interest level. And for their national interests, all of them understand that internationalism, multilateralism, diplomacy is far more effective and important than geopolitical contest and geopolitical baiting. So I expect that over time, some accommodation to de-escalate the contest between the United States and China will occur. And I'm confident that behind the scenes, there are already discussions to try to achieve some form of de-escalation. There will be face-saving for both countries. And ultimately, you'll reach a framework for what used to be called in the Cold War peaceful coexistence. Now, this is not unlikely within the term of the Biden administration, by which I mean that I think they will try to achieve it. Whether they can achieve it in one term is debatable, but I think it is their undisclosed goal. For domestic political reasons, they have to try to ensure that they have a superficial posture of being contestive and confrontational with China. But I think overall, their attempt will be to try to reach peaceful coexistence, where they can cooperate where they will resist where they can't, and they will try to compete wherever they can. And competition is not a bad thing. Competition will be a good thing for global consumers as long as geopolitics have been diffused from the equation. And that's the key point that we want to look for. Economic competition without geopolitical and security dimensions conflating and confusing and complicating the issue. And hopefully that's the direction that we'll be heading in over the next 12 to 36 months under the Biden administration. But that takes not only the efforts of the Biden administration, it also takes an effort from the administration of Xi Jinping. So for multilateralism, certainly the United States is back, as Emmanuel Macron, president of France, has said publicly at the G7. But the question in everybody's mind is, how long will it last? President Biden is 77, he'll be 81 at the end of his term. Does he have what it takes to carry on in a second term and sustain momentum? Does his Vice President Kamala Harris have what it takes, and is the American population prepared to vote not only a woman, but a woman of color into the executive office when it rejected Hillary Clinton 5 years ago? I think these are uncertainties that need to have answers before we can tell with any degree of confidence whether the United States has returned to its traditional posture of being multilateral, being pro-free trade, being pro-democracy, being a leader within trying to support the free world, as it were. These postures, I think it's important to appreciate, used to be constant regardless of whether there was a Democratic or a Republican administration. They may have differed on domestic politics, but there was general continuity in foreign diplomacy. What happened with the Trump administration was a 90-degree departure from that historical continuity and consistency. And that's naturally created a hesitancy and a hedging on the part of major powers and smaller countries such as Singapore, because of the concern of whether this is going to be a lasting return to normalcy or merely a temporary aberration where the United States is going to be swinging back and forth between extremes. Next slide, please. The encouraging news is not only is that the virus infections falling, but global trade is recovering and recovering strongly. The main beneficiary has been China. On the principle of first in and first out of the pandemic, the virus is now less than endemic in China, although there are outbreaks locally and periodically. They have been able to make it under control, and this has led to them having a strong economic recovery from where they were 18 months ago. You can see that in the United States, there's also an emerging recovery from the recession as their vaccination rates go up. They are now past 65% single dose and past 55% fully vaccinated. And that rate of improvement is very notable because the program for vaccination did start under the Trump administration, to be fair to them, but its acceleration was truly manifested only in the Biden administration under the Project Warp Speed, which again was introduced under the Trump administration in 2020. And this pickup has clearly had an impact in how they've been able to return to opening up their economy. And there's a lesson in this from China and from the US and from places like New Zealand and Australia for a country like Singapore. But I'll talk about that more later on. Thank you. So Southeast Asian economies have also recovered strongly on a comparative basis to other economies in the world. But Singapore is still a lagging performer, in part due to our policy choices about opening up and how fast we're opening up. But we are on the part of recovery on a comparative year-on-year basis. It's very important to keep in mind the difference between relative and absolute performance. On a relative basis, we are performing better 2021 compared to 2020, but 2020 was a very low base. On an absolute basis, we have a very weak recovery. Let's carry on. Another important driver in the 21st century is urbanization. Now, COVID-19 has thrown into doubt a lot of the assumptions we made about urbanization over the last 30 to 40 years, primarily because the density of urbanization works in favor of the virus. My view is that urbanization will continue to be a relentless force in the 21st century. It will not be slowed down by COVID-19. Already we see cities which were very hard hit, like New York City, open up. The people who left New York City start to return. And notwithstanding work from home as an opportunity and an alternative to working from office, many companies and large companies in particular, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, do want to see their workforces return to working from office because they feel that there's spontaneity, there's serendipity, there's creativity, there's better productivity when people are working physically together than when they're working remotely. Now, this is a view not necessarily shared by the workforces themselves, although a good proportion of those workforces do want to return to work primarily because of personal reasons and also professional reasons. So I think this is an issue that it's going to continue to be a developing and evolving story. We may well end up in a hybrid economy world where some proportion of the workforce works from home and some proportion of the workforce works from office. And some companies choose to have fully work from office, and some companies choose to have a fully work from home. And clearly this is going to have an impact on aspects such as the real estate market, particularly commercial real estate. And it's going to have an aspect of impact on how work relations at a personal and professional level manifest themselves over time. It's too early to tell how much and to what intensity these forces pulling in different directions will manifest themselves. But I don't think it will be a mutually exclusive world where we're going in one direction or another. However, I will point out that increasingly, cities will be the dominant points of competition rather than just countries. And so cities need to be able to adapt to what COVID-19 has taught them. And one of the key issues that has been thrown up by COVID-19 is that remote working through digitalization has made the difference between economies that have coped better and economies which have coped less well. If you look at this particular framework, which is in my book, Confronting COVID-19, looking at the rest of the 21st century, COVID notwithstanding, I divided the world into three categories. Digital havens, where you have people who are like digital masters. They are people who control large companies, which are platform-based. We're talking about Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, Google. People who are digital Jedis. These are people who are very adept at working in the digital space. Glenn, I think the slides disappeared. Can we return to the slides, please? Right. Digital consumers, those who are comfortable at consuming services and products digitally. And also digital radicals. These are your hackers. These are people who want to take advantage of the situation where the economy becomes increasingly digitalized. And we are seeing and have seen a rise in digital hacking during the course of the life of COVID-19. Then you have digital middle spaces. But unfortunately, in these kinds of middle spaces, they are not going to be dominant. They're going to have a lot of digital drones and digital consumers. Digital drones are people who are working within the digital supply chain pipeline, maybe making computers, making servers, and making devices, but they are not dominant forces within the digital space. They're not creating the kind of economic value that digital masters would be. And finally, there's going to be a large category of countries in the developing world, especially, which are going to be digital deserts. This is where they're going to be digital drones. They may be playing a small role in the manufacturing or the supply chain, but they're going to be a lot of digital refugees. These are people who have education in their countries, but seek a better life in digital middle spaces and digital havens. And you're also going to have digital radicals in this part of the world. These are people who are very unhappy with the state of affairs in their particular countries, and they may try to disrupt the situation in other countries. So North Korea is an example of potential digital radical, which possesses significant cybersecurity capabilities, or cyber threat capabilities to be more accurate, and is not afraid to use them when necessary. Russia is also another country that has shown itself to have a propensity to interfere in democratic elections. And of course, there's China. But I think it's realistic and important to appreciate that all countries, including the United States, have set up cyber commands, cyber capabilities, and they will be not only defensive, but offensive in nature. So urbanization will continue, digitalization will continue. What really matters is then the quality of governance in the kind of institutions, whether that's institution of law, institution of government, the nature of public civic relations, the nature of political structures, whether they can cope with these evolutions in order to maintain stability in governance, stability in economies, and stability in populations, so that prosperity and peace can prevail, as opposed to conflict and strife. Let me now come to Singapore's situation. it has improved remarkably. Notwithstanding the daily headlines of yesterday we had 10 cases, today we had 19 cases, it's important to understand when, from a statistical point of view, we have a population of 5,860,000. This has reduced by about 200,000 from the start of the COVID as foreign workers have gone home, and that includes construction workers, unskilled as well as skilled. If we take the daily numbers represent 0.002% of the population. If we take the weekly numbers, they represent 0.0017% of the population. So these are very small numbers. And the point here is that we have to have a sense of proportion. Today, we had our 35th fatality. Every fatality is a tragedy for a family. But from a totality point of view, our fatality rate is less than 0.05%. What's also important to keep in mind is that for those who are unvaccinated, 9% require medical attention. Of those 9%, 8% require merely ventilation, and 1% require ICU treatment. These are very low numbers in absolute terms and also on comparative terms with other countries. For those who have been vaccinated, whether single dose or fully vaccinated, the numbers are even more minute. 0.08% require some form of medical attention. So the key variable here is the vaccination rate and the vaccination ratio. Now, the Prime Minister has admitted as much that we dropped the ball in 2020 when it came to the foreign worker population. Of the 60,000 plus cases, 90% are actually from the foreign worker infections in 2020, which is why you see the cliff fall effect towards the end of 2020 into 2021, as per the previous slide where we had the graph. But I think what this has introduced into the policy making in Singapore is a degree of what I call policy hesitancy, a great caution in opening things up, a very significant resistance towards trying to open up the economy and allow more economic activities to take place, more social activities to take place because of the situation last year. But there's a second factor, which is that the dominant virus variant in Singapore today is the Delta variant, the B1617.2, which is a double mutation. It is true that this is a more virulent mutation, and it seems, somewhat higher fatality propensity. It's too early to tell. However, policy hesitancy comes with a cost. And that's an economic cost, it's a social cost, it's a psychological cost, it's an operational cost, and it's also a reputational cost for Singapore as countries view us and as expatriates view us, global talent view us as being too conservative and too cautious. Of course, we could also take the other point of view that being conservative and being cautious is beneficial for the state of public health. This brings me to the point of biology versus mechanical engineering. How the multi-ministry task force has approached defeating the virus has very much been as if they are sitting at a dashboard with a lot of controls and calibrating these controls very fine-tunedly. In fact, I joked recently with my wife that it takes a PhD to try to understand all the various restrictions across the various event levels, across the various sectors. This kind of fine-tuned calibration is actually fairly arbitrary. It is not necessarily scientifically based. Between 2 persons or 5 persons being allowed to be socially in space in a restaurant, for instance, is not based on any proven scientific evidence. However, what is proven is, of course, if there are more people together, then you may have a higher rate of infection. The point to make is that what is your threshold of sensitivity to this high rate of infection when at a population level, those infection rates are very, very low. And I think it's important that we reach a point of tension where we're willing to tolerate slightly higher levels of infections. And keep in mind what I've given as data in terms of the numbers of those infections requiring medical intervention. And the key ratio here will be the number of vaccinated. Today, more than 50% have received a single dose, and some 37% have received the full vaccination. We need to get the full vaccination ratio up to 50% and ideally up to 75% by the end of the year. Given the current rate, we will likely get to 50% by the end of July. And then somewhere in the early fourth quarter, we should get to 75% or better. Of course, this also requires the cooperation of the population in coming forward to get vaccinated. What I hope to see from the multi-ministry task force is a roadmap of opening up that is indexed towards the vaccination ratio rather than the daily rate of infection ratio. I think focusing on the daily rate infection ratio is looking at the wrong indicator. Now, in terms of Singapore's economic situation, over the last 20 years, we've pursued what is called a hub strategy. Unfortunately, this has proved both a strength when things were good, but under COVID, this has proved a significant weakness for us because connectivity has been degraded significantly. We need to continue to pursue an acceleration in digitalization to get ahead of the curve. But one of the consequences of accelerating digitalization is an impact on employment, in the sense that it's going to be possible, and it's already possible, to employ people outside the sovereign economy. So wage arbitrage will be a consideration for a large number of companies who can tap on digitalization to employ people in lower cost economies rather than within the Singapore context. And this is not going to be to the benefit of the Singapore worker. We also need to transition from a public sector-led to a public-private-led market model, where the private sector and the public sector are working more closely together on solution derivation. And I'm happy to say that the Emerging Singapore to Get Stronger Together initiative certainly follows a public-private-led model. And it's going to be exciting to see what emerges from all the actions for alliances that have been created. Finally, and this is where it's very difficult, the economic disruption that's caused by COVID actually has a side impact that is, from an economics point of view, beneficial, in that it allows for economic restructuring to take place, but this causes a tremendous amount of pain. One of the sectors that is most obviously impacted is the food and beverage sector, which is very labor intensive, very land intensive, and to some extent energy intensive, and perhaps have been overpopulated. And so COVID-19 is helping to weed out and lower and make it smaller as part of the economic pie. But of course, at the same time, we have to care for workers and support companies. What we have to do is make sure that the policies we put in place to care for workers and support companies don't cancel out the natural organic restructuring that occurs and that needs to occur through consolidation, through weeding out, through increasing productivity by the adoption of digitalization and leaner processes. So it's a difficult balance to achieve. And certainly I don't underestimate the burden that the multi-ministry task force has in front of them to try to balance this tension and to make the right timing judgments. But I think we can see from the interventions that have been made in 2021 versus 2020 that they're taking a more modest approach in 2021. That's also because in large part, they spent so much in 2020 and those expenditure flows continue to travel through the financial year 2021. Notwithstanding that they were introduced in 2020, they have a longer tail than just that financial year. Thank you. We can move to the next slide. So the recovery may be to some extent jobless as firms digitalize, automate, and outsource to wage arbitrage, as I mentioned, disintermediated by technology. The recent figures do show a pickup in employment, but this pickup may well be shallower than in previous recoveries, and more jobs may be term contract based, and there may be also greater underemployment and the danger of structurally unemployed rising. At this point, it is still retained at about 1.1%. By structurally unemployed, we mean People have been searching for a job for more than 6 months unsuccessfully. There's also a proportion who may fall out of the workforce altogether and give up their job search. And this could be another worrying consideration because of the slow recovery in absolute terms, even though there's a strengthening on a year-to-year basis. So Singapore has to compete on a bundle of virtues because of our high comparative costs. And what do I mean by a bundle of virtues? That means a business-friendly policy posture. It means the strong rule of law. It means that we have to have economic enabling policies. It means we have to invest in the future. It means we have to stay optimistic, but it also means that we have to try to open up as soon as we can once those vaccination ratios reach the thresholds of 50 and 75% and somewhere in between. We need to have interim opening up steps rather than big jumps. At 50% we'll do this, at 75% we'll do that. I think we need to have policy predictability for companies to have better certainty in terms of making hiring decisions, in terms of making investments, in terms of deciding themselves whether to open or to close, to downsize or to expand. Here, let me say that it's important to appreciate that politicians, public servants, and business operators have different understandings of timelines. For a politician, it may be a 5-year term of government. For public servants who have job security for life, long-term, medium-term, and short-term may not mean very much. But for business operators, months and weeks make a really big difference, particularly for SMEs. And to put things into context in the Singapore situation, 99% of firms in Singapore are categorized as SMEs. Only 1% are categorized as MNCs. And those 99% of firms contribute 50% of GDP. And these 99% of firms employ 70% to 73% of Singaporeans. So the greater proportion of Singaporeans have been significantly impacted by COVID, and the companies they work for have also been significantly impacted by COVID. So it's important for us to pay attention to the little guy and not just the big players. Finally, all of you will be aware of the succession challenge in the 4G. I think it's important for global investors that we restore confidence in our political continuity. It's important for the domestic population and also for the foreign investor population to show that we have the capability and the capacity to tolerate COVID and live with it as our vaccination ratios increase, and not that we stay policy hesitant and closed off to the rest of the world. And here I mentioned in my public writing again and again that we cannot pull the welcome mat away from global talent. We've got to show that we're still welcoming. And I think for those Singaporeans and long-term residents who have been vaccinated, they should be treated differently from those who have not been vaccinated when they return from their travel. I think these are considerations which I hope the multi-ministry task force will take up and hopefully make a decision upon in the near future. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions now.
So thank you, Devadas, for the presentation. I'm sure everyone found it as insightful and fascinating as I did. This is from an anonymous attendee who says, "Dear Mr. Krishnadas, I am impressed by your knowledge and assessment of the multipolar world post-COVID-19. Singapore, as a small ship in a big storm, has been able to glean the benefits of globalization since the post-war period. When we move ahead, will the benefits of globalization be evenly distributed to the local populace? Our demographic dividend from the pioneer Merdeka generations is running out and becoming an actuarial burden. 2020 was a projected year where the local workforce will be outnumbered by the foreign workforce. When COVID-19 broke, a pandemic baby bonus was announced. Despite that, the total fertility rate fell to a historic low of 1.1. I speak with the voice of a concerned parent, wondering if our national security is threatened by the dearth of soldiers. In 20 years' time, there will not be enough enlistees to defend the economic interests that have settled here. Could we have done more on the natalism front?"
Thank you for the question. It's a very challenging one. I was the head of strategy at the Ministry of Community Development, Youth and Sports many years ago. And the marriage and parenthood packages were something that I was intimately involved in. One of the things that we have noted that all 4 iterations of the M&P packages have not led to any significant improvement in the TFR. In fact, the TFR glide slope has consistently been downward. We are now at approaching 1.1, which is the lowest that we've ever been at. That was in 2020. And if we were to continue that trajectory, it will drop below 1, making us the leading low fertility rate country in the world. So your concerns are not without foundation. One of the things that we've tried to do from a national defense point of view is invest in technology, but we are coming up against the limits of how much technology can substitute for actual soldiers and trained professionals. One option that is obviously in front of us is the Israeli option of conscripting women as well as men into the armed forces. And I think at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have to face that choice. And in my view, we'll have to make that choice. Now, in the Israeli situation, the women are not posted only to healthcare or at the back end echelon kind of operations away from, but they are in combat roles as well. And so we have, as a nation, at a cultural level, at a sociological level, at a psychological level, and an emotional level, have to come to terms with the fact that both men and women have to serve in order to ensure that we have adequate numbers to secure our national security at the defense dimension. Secondly, from an economic perspective, which you also asked about, the ratio of dependency between the local workforce and the foreign workforce will continue to shift in favor of the latter. That's just a demographic reality in the same way that it's a demographic reality for national defense. While there's a lot of hype about the silver workforce, I think we have to be realistic about how much that will actually make a difference because of the difficulties of older people keeping up with fast evolving technologies, working long hours, working competitively against other economies, other cities. I'm not saying that they're going to be economically useless or irrelevant, but a young economy, an economy such as ours has to be young, has to be agile, has to be creative, has to be vibrant. And that takes young people, talented people, people with a long runway ahead of them, so they're willing to take risks. And for that, we need also a certain critical mass. And that means that we have a second important political, psychological, emotional, and sociological decision to make, which is to open up immigration in Singapore and allow more global talent to flow in. And that is going to change Singapore. It's going to change what it means to be Singapore. But unless we do so, we will increasingly and more rapidly become economically less competitive and less relevant. And that is going to have existential consequences for Singapore, not just economic consequences for Singapore. Because Singapore is an economy which is 75% trade weighted in terms of services and goods. Our domestic economy is only 25%. So unless we're globally competitive and globally relevant, we will not benefit from globalization as well as we have had over the last 30 years or 40 years. So in order to continue to benefit from globalization, we will have to make these kinds of choices at the political and policy level. Finally, let me say that as an economy, we've also run out of development headroom, by which I mean that there is no longer a textbook that we can follow to tell us what is the next step. We are what is called a frontier economy, and so we need political leaders and public officials to work closely with industry in order to innovate what's next, both in terms of goods and services, but also in terms of policy and politics. And so to me, what is important is the quality of our governance, which is a much larger consideration than simply government. So we need the community, we need the government, and we need the industry all to make positive contributions towards solutioning a better and stronger future for Singapore.
Thanks for that, Devadas.
You're
There's
welcome.
quite a few questions piling up, so I'm going to have the temerity to try and consolidate some different questions into one. Devadas, on top of the COVID issue, we now see the racism rearing its ugly head appearing in Singapore society. And he asks what your take on that is. But I'm also going to throw in, what can businesses do to diffuse the trend towards nativism and xenophobia? So taken together, it's basically racism, xenophobia. Your thoughts, Devadas? And maybe also more from the prism of businesses as well.
Well, and let me thank the both of them for those very pertinent and relevant questions. I will first make a distinction between nativism and racism. Racism is about one race having difficult relations and intolerance towards other races. This is clearly unacceptable in a heterogeneous society such as Singapore. And Singapore's social cohesion is an existential question, and it is not an optional question. It is an essential question that has to be answered every day and in every relationship and in every partnership and between every community and constituency of people. So it is something that we all have to work at a whole of nation level. But I believe that we should not take isolated events, such as some recent events that have made the news, and blow that out of proportion to say that the majority population, ethnic population, which is the Chinese, are racist. I do not believe so. I've worked with, I've served under, and I've commanded, and of course I lead a company myself today, where we have a demographic mix of ethnicities and ages, and we all get along perfectly fine. I think it is important to keep in mind that there is a very small minority of people who are racist, and I would draw a distinction between racism and chauvinism. Racism is out and out intolerance and hatred. Racial chauvinism is probably more present. This is where there's a positive bias towards one's own ethnicity rather than having an inclusive mindset about all ethnicities. This is not about hatred. It's actually quite a normal and natural and understandable human propensity to identify more closely with those who speak like you, who look like you, and who have your belief systems. I believe that this is something that over time we will be able to slowly overcome, even though it will always be present. One notable statistic is that 1 in 5 marriages in Singapore today is an interracial marriage. This is a big contrast from 10 years ago, even more still from 20 to 30 years ago. So I think what we have in Singapore is increasingly a acceptance of each other, and acceptance of each other not only in the traditional CIMO community ethnicity split, but in the sense that we are much more cosmopolitan. Of those 1 in 5 intermarriages, almost half are marriages with foreigners who have come to Singapore to work or to study or to live. The second question is nativism. I think here where businesses are concerned, businesses have to understand that to compete globally, they need talent from the globe. Singapore just simply does not have the production capability from a demographic point of view to produce enough people with enough talent to fill all the requirements of an economy that is not only evolving, but has to grow. For Singapore, growth is an existential reality. Without growth, social tensions may arise. Without growth that is inclusive, that all ethnicities and all people can participate within the economy, we will also see social tensions arise. And if we see economic inequality within the demographic space, where some communities are concentrated at the lower income and others are concentrated at the higher income, I think that will also increase social tensions. This is a very complex issue, that cannot be solved overnight. But I think that the government has made considerable efforts to try to uplift all ethnicities in Singapore through investments in health, in infrastructure, and in education, and that the national service is a disintermediation mechanism, sociological one, to force ethnicities to live together. And I think also the public housing policy of ensuring an equal distribution of ethnicities according to the demographic spread in our public housing estates has been a very important contribution to social stability. And I think for companies, it's important that employers take an inclusive view to employment. And that applies not only to foreign-owned companies, it applies equally to domestically owned companies and to MNCs and SMEs alike. We have the agency of power as business owners and operators to make hiring choices. And we should make hiring choices which are not racist nor chauvinist, but focus on the merits. And we can find a way to make our organizations work better, more productively, more creatively, more innovatively when we do so.
Thank you, Devadas. Okay, this one came in quite a while ago. Wage arbitrage only exists when the value add of the local workforce does not exceed the costs of being based locally. For the same quality and volume of work, unit wage rates are ideally equivalent across borders. So in a two-part question to this, is our local workforce underqualified to undertake the expectations of the market? And secondly, is our local workforce priced out by the incident costs of being based locally?
That's a very good question, and I'll try to answer it in the simplest way possible. The simple fact is that our local workforce on a comparative wage basis is much more costly than the workforces in many other countries in the region. And I think it is simplistic to assume that there is no talent in other countries in the region. I give you the example of Yogyakarta, which has a very vibrant technology SME sector. And actually many Singaporean companies have been employing people from Indonesia, from the Philippines, and from Vietnam, who are as well qualified as Singaporeans, but are at much cheaper cost. And I would add India to that equation as well. So the Singaporean worker has a significant challenge before him or her, to upgrade their skills and be as valuable and as relevant as possible to the economy and to employers, more relevant than their regional competitors, in order to justify their wage levels. So our upward wage levels is a good thing when seen in isolation. It certainly means that our workers are benefiting from the economy. But what COVID has taught us, it is also a competitive threat to their employability. And it's something that is very difficult to balance out. It is notable that in the Singapore case, the wage share of GDP is one of the lowest in the world at only 43%. So there is actually headroom for wage rates to go up further from that perspective. But doing so would increase the economic threat to employability from our regional employment basis. And that's going to be something that is going to be a continuing challenge going forward. As to whether our local workforce is qualified or not, I think we cannot generalize across the workforce. I think it's certainly important to look at a sectoral level. We're doing very well in certain areas like agri-tech, like in fintech, in manufacturing tech, in precision engineering. We are certainly at the forefront. But in many other areas, there is much room for improvement. And in some areas, improvement will actually mean lower employability. So for instance, in F&B, if robotization of waitressing or waiting service becomes commonplace, there will be less space for employing Singaporeans in this area. The same would be true in the cleaning sector. But these are low-skilled or unskilled services. And as an aggregate policy, what we want to see is Singaporeans fill in more skilled and semi-skilled occupations and come out of the low-skilled or unskilled occupational categories, which we would expect foreigners to be able to fill at a lower cost.
Great. Thanks for that. Okay, next. To what extent do you think the reopening trajectories of North America and Europe will influence Singapore's path? To what extent would Singapore be able to sustain a divergent path over the coming 12 months?
First of all, I would say that the opening up of North America and Western European countries, and also Australasian countries, Australia and New Zealand, will serve as examples to us, not just at a country level, but at the local level. They are very large economies. When you look at the United States, different parts of the different states and different parts of different states will perform better than others. So there will be learning lessons for us. And it's important that we pay attention to what these lessons are, not just in terms of how much we don't open up, but really to help us to open up. And I think this is where the sensitivity threshold really matters, that we pay attention to. Clearly, the MTF has a very low sensitivity threshold, and it's very hard to make a case to a family infected with COVID or to someone who's lost a loved one to COVID. We've had 35 fatalities, that we should be able to tolerate a higher level of infection rates, and that may well mean a slightly higher level of fatality rates in exchange for opening up the economy and relieving the stress on our businesses. It's very hard to make that equation understandable and acceptable to anyone, including to myself for that matter, being a business owner, but also being a family man. But it has to be made, and it is one that has been made in these other economies. And so the divergent pathway, as you put it, where we stay closed and they open up, is not going to be very helpful to us over the next 12 months. We have to focus on vaccination ratios reaching between 50 and 75%, and have a progressive pathway of opening up that is transparent and is made public, which means businesses can plan, businesses can have confidence that we're moving in this direction, and not be overly obsessed with actual case numbers on a daily basis or even new clusters on a daily basis. We should continue our policy of aggressive testing and contact tracing. That should continue. Masking should continue until such extent that we get to a state where enough of the population is vaccinated and the clusters and new cases decline in negative correlation to the increase in vaccination rates. Once we see that negative correlation manifest itself, which I believe is already starting to happen, even though every day we have screaming numbers that we have 10 plus cases and 9 cases, as I've already explained, they represent 0.0002% of your population every day, or 0.001.7% of the population on a weekly basis. These are very minute numbers. So I believe that we will have to we cannot sustain that divergent path for longer, nor would we need to, because our vaccination ratios will reach 75% before the end of the year.
Thanks again. So this was one of the first questions asked, that in the past, when a rising power was challenging an existing power, it often, but not always, ended up in war. We already have an economic and currency war ongoing. So why and how do you think a military conflict can be avoided in the future?
This is what you're referring to is a Thucydides trap. And Graham Allison has written a best-selling book on that. And by the way, he was my tutor when I was in the postgraduate school. It is true that historically there has been a higher propensity for conflict when a rising power meets a competitive rival, particularly when the incumbent power is seemingly on the decline. I think it's important for us to note that that's not true in every historical case. That's been true in a number of historical cases. Secondly, I think it's important to note that the world is globalized and integrated in a way that we have not seen historically to the extent that it is today, and that both China and the United States have a lot to lose by entering into a security competition as opposed to simply an economic competition and a diplomatic competition. And I think both sides realize that. One of the risks is the risk of an operational incident, localized incident happening in the South China Sea during one of the freedom of navigation exercises carried out routinely by the 7th Fleet, escalating into something much, much bigger. We did see this in the 1960s, in 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin incident between the United States and North Vietnam. But I think there's enough rationality in the Biden administration to keep in mind that these sort of incidences have to be contained. They have to be seen in perspective and in proportion. And what is important is that politicians on both sides do not allow nationalism and parochialism to compel and drive them under political pressure to escalate issues beyond a certain threshold, which forces a general confrontation to occur. I think I have enormous confidence in the current reality, as opposed to the last 4 years, that neither side wants that or seeks that, and they will find a framework to work together to try to ensure that those kinds of incidents are minimized or avoided, or where they occur, there is a form of de-escalation framework that can be immediately be activated and put in place. It's important to understand that during the Cold War, this was certainly a framework. There was certainly a framework between the Warsaw Pact countries and NATO, where there were occasional operational incidents to quickly de-escalate. The hotline between Washington and Moscow was a perfect example of that. But even at the operational level, there were protocols that were followed by regional and theater commanders to avoid escalation without political permission. So this is a work in progress, but I'm confident that neither party is actually looking for a war.
Okay. Well, like all of the rest of the questions, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. So thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. Please do check out these links to firstly purchase Confronting COVID-19, a strategic playbook for leaders and decision makers. You can get that from goguru.com or any other of your favorite bookstores, including your favorite bricks and mortar stores. Do support those if you can. For more information about the book publisher, you can visit www.marshallcavendish.com. And for more information on Devadas and the Future Moves group, please visit us at future-moves.com. So with that, thank you once again, and it's over and out from us.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn.